Hello everyone, and welcome back to Unsaid Hours. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. My great-grandmother was the kind of person you noticed before she even said a word. Even now, when I try to picture her the way she was before the nursing home and the disease, I don't remember her sitting still. I remember motion. I remember the way she would come into a room like a gust of wind, like the air changed because she was there. She was Scottish, born with that sharp, musical rhythm in her voice that could turn a simple sentence into something you listened to twice. When she was happy, she laughed with her whole body. When she was angry, she swore like she'd been raised in the engine room of a ship. It wasn't polite, it wasn't delicate, but it fit her so perfectly that nobody dared to tell her to watch her mouth. If she was frustrated, the words came out like sparks off metal, and then she'd look at you with those bright green eyes and grin like she'd won. Those eyes were the first thing anyone mentioned about her, even people who barely knew her. A piercing, almost impossible shade of green. I've seen old black and white photos from when she was young, and you can still tell she was beautiful because everything about her face was alive. It's strange, but you can almost see the light in her eyes, even when the photo has no color. And that's what she had. More than beauty, a force. She could be warm and fierce in the same breath. She could insult you and make you feel loved at the same time. She had that rare gift of making people feel chosen, like if she paid attention to you, you mattered. She was also, without question, the best prankster our family ever had. Not cruel jokes, not anything meant to hurt. She just loved mischief. She loved the moment someone's face shifted from calm to confusion. That little pause where the brain tries to catch up. She'd set things up days in advance, patient as a cat. She'd hide a rubber spider in a teapot. You'd tape a funny note under someone's chair, switch the sugar and salt in a way that didn't ruin anything but made you sputter once and then laugh. And when the joke landed, her eyes would sparkle like she was 10 years old. There was one thing she talked about for as long as anyone could remember. Something that sounded silly when you were young and only grew stranger the older you got. The numbers 1111. She didn't treat it like a cute coincidence. She treated it like a visitor that kept showing up. She would glance at a clock and go, "There it is again, 1111." Sometimes she'd say it with amusement. Sometimes she'd say it like she was taking attendance. There were years when we didn't have digital clocks everywhere. There were years when the only clock in the room had hands and you had to actually look. She still found it. She'd be stirring something on the stove, look up, and there it was. She'd be laying out plates for lunch, glance at the wall clock, and her whole face would change for a moment, like she'd seen someone step into the doorway. When I was little, I thought it was just another one of her funny quirks. Something adults did, like talking about the weather. But it never stopped. And over time, it didn't stay with just her. My grandmother, her daughter, began to notice it too. She'd sigh and say, "It's that time again," as if the time had a personality. Then my mother started. She'd be making coffee. I'd check the microwave and call out from the kitchen, half laughing, half annoyed. Guess what it is? Eventually, it reached me. It wasn't that I was searching for it, not at first. It just kept appearing. I would glance at my digital alarm clock in the middle of the night for no reason I could explain, and it would read 11:11. I'd look at the clock in the car at a red light and catch it for a second before it changed. In high school, I'd be sitting in class, bored out of my mind. Then something would tug at my attention. I'd check my watch, 11:11. If you tell this to someone outside the family, the explanation comes quickly, neat and rational. Pattern recognition, confirmation bias. You notice what you expect to see. You think about it so you catch it. It sounds reasonable. It probably is reasonable in a clean, scientific sense. But family stories don't live in clean places. They live in kitchens and hallways and the quiet spaces at the edges of grief. And in my family, 1111 became something that sat between a joke and a sign. A small, persistent tap on the shoulder that moved through generations like an inside joke nobody could explain. By the time I was 10, my great-grandmother lived in a nursing home. I can still smell that place if I think about it for long enough. It didn't matter which facility it was. They all have the same core smell, like they were built out of it. Sharp disinfectant that stings your nose. Stale cigarette smoke that clings to someone's sweater even when nobody is smoking anymore. And underneath it, something faintly metallic, like a penny held too long in your hand. I used to think it smelled like something preserved, like a museum of bodies still breathing. The halls were too quiet, but not peaceful. Quiet in the way a building feels when people are trying not to make noise because noise might remind them they're waiting. The floors were linoleum, see, always shining under harsh overhead lights. The nurses' shoes squeaked. Wheelchairs rolled slowly like they were afraid of disturbing the air. Sometimes you'd hear a television murmuring in a room, low enough that you couldn't make out words, just the shape of a show. Other times you'd hear someone crying in a way that was raw and private, and you'd pretend you hadn't heard it because everyone had their own grief they were carrying. I hated going there, not because I didn't love her. I loved her fiercely, but I hated what the place meant. It felt like a waiting room for something you didn't want to name. When she was first diagnosed with Alzheimer's, the family talked about it with that careful calm people use when they're trying not to panic. At first it looked like forgetfulness. She repeated stories, she misplaced things. She would laugh it off, swear at herself, and pretend it didn't matter. But it was like watching a shoreline crumble. One small piece falls, then another, then suddenly a whole section breaks away. As the disease progressed, it stopped being cute. It stopped being quirky. She would look at familiar faces like they were strangers, and then mask it with a smile so nobody would notice she was lost. She'd start a sentence and trail off, eyes shifting as if she'd been interrupted by someone only she could see. Sometimes she would accuse someone of stealing something that was sitting plainly on the table. But sometimes she would be perfectly fine for 10 minutes, and then become frightened of the bathroom or convinced the hallway led somewhere else. The last year was the worst. She went fully into dementia. Most days she didn't know who any of us were. The woman who had once commanded a room would stare at us blankly, her face empty in a way that hurt more than anger ever could. Sometimes she spoke to people who weren't there, full conversations with someone from her childhood, with her long-dead husband, with voices that felt real to her. Sometimes she forgot she couldn't walk well and would try to stand, only to fall back into the bed, confused and furious at her own body. Sometimes she would sit in silence for long stretches, staring at a corner of the room as if the corner was telling her something. It felt like watching a house go dark one room at a time. And yet, even when everything else began to slip, even when names and places and faces scattered, the one thing stayed anchored in her mind like a nail. 1111. She would say it suddenly with a clarity that didn't match the rest of her. She'd point a trembling finger toward the clock on the wall. Or she'd whisper it like she was telling you something important. 1111. It wasn't always cheerful. Sometimes it sounded like comfort. Sometimes it sounded like a warning. Sometimes it sounded like recognition. My grandmother believed it meant something. My mother did too. I did. In the way a child believes the stories that keep a family stitched together. Even when I tried to doubt it later, it was hard to shake. because it was so consistent, so persistent, like a rhythm that refused to stop. Late one October, she slipped into a coma. The change felt sudden, even though we knew it was coming. She had been declining, but the coma made it final in a way nothing else had. The doctors used careful phrases, the kind meant to soften a blow. Multiple small strokes. Declining brain function. Low responsiveness. They said she was not waking up. They said even if she did, she would not be herself. They told us there was no meaningful brain activity in the ways that mattered for recovery. They talked about comfort care and quality of life. She had not spoken in weeks. She barely reacted when we held her hand. Sometimes she didn't even flinch when we touched her forehead. It was like her body remained warm and breathing, while the person who had once lived inside it had already stepped away. My grandmother struggled with it the most. That was her mother, and not just mother in the ordinary way. My great-grandmother had lived with her for years after her husband died. They had been close in a way that made them seem like partners in life. They were friends. They fought. They laughed. They shared the sort of intimacy only people who have survived decades together can have. Now, my grandmother wasn't ready to let her go, and it showed in every part of her face. Grief was already eating at her, even before death arrived to make it official. Then November 11th came. That evening we got the call. The nurse's voice was gentle, but there was urgency under it. Her vital signs were dropping. Her pulse was weak. Her breathing was shallow and irregular. The nurse told us as kindly as you can tell someone, something like that it would likely be the final night. I remember my chest tightening when I heard it. I remember the way my mother went very still, as if moving would make it real. I remember my grandmother's eyes filling with tears before she even spoke. I begged to go with them. I was young, and people sometimes try to shield children from death, but I couldn't bear not to be there. She wasn't just a relative I saw on holidays. She had been part of my life in a way that felt immediate. She had given me an Oscar the Grouch teddy bear when I was little, and for a long time I had carried it like a talisman. Even that night, I brought it. It sounds childish, but it was comfort. It was proof she had loved me with her hands and her time, not just with family obligation. We arrived around 8. The nursing home at night is different than during the day. Fewer voices, less movement. The building feels hollow, as if it's holding its breath along with the people inside it. The hallway lights were dimmer. The air felt heavier, thick with that same chemical smell, but mixed now with something else. A faint scent of damp wool from coats, and the sweet, cloying smell of flowers somewhere in the building. Her room was quiet, except for the machines. The monitor beeped steadily, a small, regular sound that felt almost cruel in its calmness. The oxygen machine made a soft hiss. Her chest rose and fell shallowly. She looked smaller than I remembered, as if she had been slowly shrinking into the bed. We took positions around her like we were keeping watch. My grandmother held her hand. My mother stood close to the bed, rubbing her forehead gently. I stood on the other side, clutching the teddy bear against my chest, terrified and numb at the same time. We talked to her because it felt wrong not to. We told her we loved her. We told her she wasn't alone. My mother tried to tell stories like she always did when things were too heavy, trying to bring light into the room. She spoke about childhood moments, about holidays, about funny things my great-grandmother had done when she was still herself. My grandmother whispered memories through tears. She leaned close and spoke as if her mother could hear every word, as if she was trying to build a bridge with her voice. For a long time, nothing changed. She remained still. The beeping continued. The air seemed to press in closer. And then something happened that I still struggle to describe, without my skin tightening. My great-grandmother opened her eyes. It wasn't the slow flutter of someone drifting in and out. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't the vacant stare I had seen so many times during the dementia. She opened them wide, clear and focused, like someone waking up from the deepest sleep of their life. Those green eyes were there again, bright, sharp, unmistakably her. She looked around the room. Her gaze moved deliberately from face to face, landing on my grandmother, then my mother, then me. It was as if she was taking us in, making sure we were real, making sure we were there. My grandmother made a sound that wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite a gasp. It was like her whole body had been struck by hope and pain at the same time. My great-grandmother squeezed her hand. It wasn't a weak twitch. It was a clear squeeze, the kind you give when you're trying to reassure someone. Then she smiled. The smile erased years. It was the same smile I remembered from when she used to tease us, when her eyes would gleam and she would look like she was about to pull a joke. It lit her face from the inside, and for a moment, the disease seemed like a bad dream, something that had never happened. In a voice so steady it made my heart jump, she said, "It's okay. It's okay." My grandmother broke. She leaned over, burying her face against her mother's shoulder, crying in that uncontrolled, full-body way you only do when something splits open inside you. My mother began crying too, hand over her mouth as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. I cried because the room felt too full, because it was beautiful and terrifying and impossible all at once. I reached for my great-grandmother's other hand and held it, expecting it to feel like paper. She squeezed back with surprising strength. For a few seconds, she was more alive than she had been in years. Not just awake, present, there with us. It felt like the person we had been losing had stepped back through a door that had been closing for a long time, just long enough to say goodbye properly. Then the monitor changed. If you've never heard it, it's hard to explain how quickly sound can turn into dread. The steady beep broke. There was a pause. Then a long, flat tone filled the room, smooth and unbroken. A nurse rushed in, then a doctor. It wasn't chaotic, but it was urgent in a controlled way. The doctor looked at her, checked her pulse, listened, and then his face settled into a kind of practiced sadness. He gently guided my grandmother back from the bed, not rough, just firm, because he had done this before and knew what people do when they don't want to let go. He wrote something in the chart, and just like that, she was gone. The change in the room was immediate, not dramatic, but unmistakable. The air felt different. The bed held the same body, but the presence that had been there seconds before was absent. The room was filled with our quiet crying and the distant hum of the building. The doctor looked at his watch, then at the wall clock, making sure he recorded the time correctly. It was November 11th. The time was 11:11 p.m. There was a moment where none of us spoke. My grandmother lifted her head slowly, face wet, eyes wide, looking at the clock like she couldn't trust it. My mother stared too, as if expecting the numbers to change into something else. I looked from the clock to their faces and back again. It didn't feel like fear, not in the way ghost stories usually do. It felt like awe, like the room had become strange and sacred at the same time, like something had lined up so perfectly that logic didn't have a place to stand. Even the nurse paused when she realized what time it was, not because she knew our family tradition, but because some coincidences are so precise they make you hesitate. In the days after, the story spread through the family the way stories do, passed from phone calls to kitchen tables to quiet talks at night. Some people cried when they heard it. Some people shook their heads. Some people looked uncomfortable, as if they didn't like the idea that death could carry meaning. My great-aunt, my great-grandmother's daughter, was one of the uncomfortable ones. She had always mocked the 11:11 thing, not gently, not playfully. She called it nonsense, superstition, garbage. If anyone mentioned it at dinner, she would roll her eyes and make a face like the conversation had become embarrassing. She saw herself as the grounded one, the realist. She didn't want mystery in the family, and she didn't want anything that sounded spiritual or woo-woo. The weekend after the death, we held the wake at a local funeral home. It was a stormy autumn day, and cold rain pouring down in sheets. The trees outside were bare, branches black against the gray sky, like skeleton fingers scratching at the air. People arrived in damp coats and shook water off umbrellas. The building smelled of flowers and wet wool, and that faint, unavoidable scent of polished wood and old carpet. Inside, the room was dim but warm, filled with the low murmur of voices and the soft sounds people make when they are trying to be respectful. There were tissues everywhere. Someone had placed lilies in tall vases, their scent heavy and sweet, almost too much. I approached the open casket with my family. Seeing her like that was another kind of shock, because death makes faces look both familiar and strange. Her features were still hers, but the spark that had once danced behind her eyes was gone. She looked peaceful, but peace can be unsettling when you've seen someone so alive. I cried quietly beside her, I holding the Oscar the Grouch teddy bear in my arms like I was still a child, because in that moment I felt like one. The bear had been mine for years, worn soft, a little faded, but it carried her memory in its fabric. It felt right to have it there, like bringing a piece of our history into the room. Later, I walked toward the back where my great-aunt and great-uncle stood speaking with someone. My mother and grandmother joined me. They were tired, their grief raw. And because grief makes people reach for meaning, they began retelling the story of that last night. They described the coma, the sudden opening of her eyes, the way she smiled, the words she said. They described the exact moment the monitor changed. They told it like they still couldn't believe it, like repeating it was a way of checking if it was real. My great-aunt listened with her arms folded. Her face held that familiar skeptical set, lips tight. The eyes narrowed like she expected exaggeration. When my grandmother mentioned the time, November 11th at 11:11, my great-aunt made a small sound that could have been a scoff. And then the power went out. It happened instantly. The lights cut. The soft music stopped. The ventilation hum died. The room fell into sudden darkness so complete it stole the breath from everyone. There were gasps, scattered and startled. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." You could hear the rain pounding against the windows more clearly now, as if the storm had leaned closer. The funeral home felt suddenly enormous and empty. For a second, nobody moved. Nobody knew what to do in the dark, surrounded by grief and an open casket somewhere in the room. Instinct took over. My hand went to my wrist. I was wearing a Timex with an indigo light, the kind that glows soft blue when you press the button. I pressed it, and the face of the watch lit up like a tiny rectangle of calm in the blackness. 11:11. The numbers glowed in that blue light with a clarity that made my stomach tighten. It was so exact, so clean, it felt like the world had arranged it on purpose. I lifted my wrist, not thinking, just doing, and held it toward my great-aunt so she could see. The blue light lit her face from below, turning her expression into something stark and honest. For a moment, she looked frozen. Then I watched something change in her, like a mask slipping. The disbelief drained away. In its place came something I still have trouble naming. It wasn't screaming fear, it wasn't panic. It was more like a sudden awareness that she had stepped onto ground she didn't understand. A kind of stunned acceptance, as if her mind was trying to build a rational explanation and failing. She stared at the watch. Then she looked out into the dark room as if expecting someone to be standing there, smiling. No one spoke, not her, not my grandmother, not my mother. The silence felt heavy, full of meaning nobody wanted to say out loud. A few minutes later, the power came back on. The lights returned, flickering once before settling. People laughed nervously, trying to shake it off. Someone blamed the storm, which made sense. Storms knock out power all the time. The funeral home staff apologized. Conversations restarted in quiet murmurs. But my great-aunt didn't mock 11:11 again. Not that day, not ever. After that, the story became part of our family in a new way. Not just a quirky tradition, not just a coincidence we teased each other about. It became a thread tied through generations, looping from my great-grandmother's life into her death, and then into the room where we mourned her. It was as if she had reached back across the divide, not with a haunting, not with a whisper in the dark, but with timing so perfect it felt like her, and that fit her too. Because she loved jokes. She loved the last word. She loved catching people off guard. She loved watching someone's certainty wobble for a second. Part of me finds it beautiful. Part of me finds it unsettling. If you want to be logical, you can find explanations. You can say it was chance. You can say storms knock out power. You can say a lot of people die in the evening and clocks can line up. You can say we were primed to notice that number because it mattered to us. But logic doesn't explain the feeling in the room when her eyes opened, clear and green, and she looked at us like she had been waiting. It doesn't explain the way her voice sounded like itself again, steady and warm. It doesn't explain why the exact number she had chased all her life was waiting on the clock at the moment she slipped away. It also doesn't explain why, in a dark funeral home full of mourners, with the storm raging outside, my wrist lit up blue with 11:11 right as my great-aunt was rolling her eyes at the story. Maybe the universe doesn't wink. Maybe it doesn't send messages. Maybe people like my great-grandmother simply leave deep marks behind, and we find patterns because we can't bear the idea that they just vanish. All I know is that when I think of her now, I don't picture her in that bed at the end. I picture her as she was, fierce and laughing, swearing loudly and then smiling as if she'd just told the best joke in the world. And sometimes when I'm alone and I glance at the clock without thinking and see 11:11 looking back at me, I don't know whether to feel comforted or watched. Maybe it's both, because some people don't leave quietly. Their presence is too big. Their energy doesn't fade like smoke. It lingers in small, sharp moments like the glow of numbers on a clock, making you pause and remember that the line between life and death might not be as clean as we pretend. Even writing this down makes my hands feel cold. It feels like reliving it, like standing in that nursing home again with the machines beeping and my grandmother crying, and then hearing that clear voice say, "It's okay." And it feels like standing in that funeral home again, the storm pressing against the windows, the room falling suddenly into darkness, and the soft blue glow on my wrist showing a number my family can never unsee. Every last word of it is true. And whether it was a sign or a coincidence, it did what it did to us. It changed the way we spoke about her. It changed the way we looked at time. And for the rest of my life, I don't think I will ever see 11:11 without feeling, for just a second, that her bright green eyes are on me, full of mischief, as if she's still finding ways to surprise us. I knew her during our freshman year of college. We were not best friends, but we had enough classes together and enough overlapping circles that we spoke often. We would sit near each other during lectures, complain about homework, and sometimes end up at the same small gatherings on weekends. She had an easy kind of personality, the type that made people feel comfortable around her quickly. She laughed easily, trusted people quickly, and still carried that wide-eyed excitement that many freshmen had during those first months away from home. She was 18 then, like most of us. Everything still felt new. Dorm life, freedom, late-night food runs, loud weekend parties, and the strange sense that we were finally living adult lives while still not quite knowing what that meant. The weekend she disappeared started like any other. A group from our campus had heard about a large party happening at another university about 25 miles north of us. That kind of thing was common. Students moved between campuses all the time, especially on weekends when parties spread through social media and word of mouth. It was supposed to be one of those huge house parties where half the people there didn't even know the host. She didn't go alone. She went with another girl she knew, someone who had a car and offered to drive. As far as anyone knew, it was just going to be a normal night. They would stay for a few hours, meet people, drink a little, and then head back to campus. Nothing about it seemed dangerous. The party itself, from what people later described, was exactly what you would expect from a large college gathering. The house was packed. Music shook the walls. People crowded into every room, some dancing, some playing drinking games, others just sitting in corners talking loudly over the noise. The air smelled like beer and sweat and cheap cologne. Doors opened and closed constantly as people drifted outside to smoke or get fresh air. It was chaotic, but it was the kind of chaos everyone there considered normal. At some point during the night, she separated from the friend who drove her. That also wasn't unusual. At big parties, people often split up and regroup later. Someone goes to play a game in the backyard. Someone else runs into friends from another school. Someone gets pulled into a conversation in the kitchen. It was the kind of environment where you could lose track of someone for an hour without thinking twice about it. According to a few people who remembered speaking with her, she mentioned she was going to play cornhole outside for a while. Someone else said she talked about hanging out with a group near the back of the house. After that, the trail went quiet. Her friend didn't realize anything was wrong at first. She assumed they had just gotten separated in the crowd. She moved through the house looking for her casually at first, checking the rooms where people were gathered, asking a few people if they had seen her. No one seemed concerned yet, but time kept passing. An hour turned into 2. Her friend checked outside. She checked the backyard games. She walked through the house again, pushing through groups of strangers, calling her name over the music. A few people said they had seen her earlier, but no one could say where she had gone. Eventually, her friend tried calling her phone. It went straight to voicemail. She tried again. Voicemail. At first, people assumed her phone battery had died. That happened constantly at parties, but as more time passed, the mood started to change. What had begun as casual searching slowly turned into something more anxious. A few people joined in looking for her. They checked bathrooms. They walked around the outside of the house. Someone looked through the nearby parking lot. Still nothing. By the time the party began to thin out late in the night, her friend was openly panicking. She knew something was wrong. She hadn't left with her. No one remembered seeing her walk out the front door. No one could remember seeing her get into a car. It was like she had simply vanished into the crowd. Eventually, the police were contacted. Statements were taken. Her family was notified. Within hours, the situation had moved beyond a missing friend at a party and into something much darker. Back on our campus, the news spread quickly. At first, people thought it was some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe she had gone home with someone and forgot to tell her friend. Maybe her phone was dead and she was staying with someone she had just met. But as the next day passed with no contact, the feeling around campus changed. Flyers started appearing on bulletin boards and light poles. Social media posts spread rapidly. Students shared her picture and asked if anyone had seen her. Classes continued, but no one was really focused. Everyone kept talking about it. People replayed the party in their minds, trying to remember if they had noticed anything strange. People who had been there spoke with police, and trying to recall small details that suddenly felt important. But no clear answers came. One day passed, then another. By the 4th day, the situation had turned into something everyone feared. Search efforts spread through nearby areas. Volunteers helped distribute flyers. Police began investigating more aggressively. 10 days passed like that. 10 long, uncertain days where no one knew if she was alive or dead. Then everything changed in a way no one expected. A homeless man found her near a bus stop in the city. He later said he noticed movement near the sidewalk early in the morning. At first, he thought someone had fallen or was drunk. But when he looked closer, he realized the person on the ground was trying to crawl. It was her. She was dragging herself toward the bus stop bench, barely able to move. So her clothes were torn and dirty. Her skin was pale and thin from dehydration. One arm bent at an unnatural angle. Her leg twisted in a way that made it clear something was badly broken. When the man approached, she tried to speak, but her voice barely came out. She was begging for help. He immediately called emergency services and stayed with her while they waited. A few passing drivers began stopping when they saw what was happening. Within minutes, several people had gathered, trying to help without making her injuries worse. When police and paramedics arrived, they realized how serious her condition was. She was severely malnourished, dehydrated, covered in bruises, and both her arm and leg were broken. She was taken to the hospital immediately. What she told investigators afterwards stunned everyone. At the party, someone had slipped something into her drink. She didn't know exactly when it happened. She only remembered that at some point the world around her began to blur. Her thoughts slowed. Her body felt heavy and uncooperative. She tried to stay with the group she was talking to, but everything around her started to feel distant and unreal. A group of men noticed her condition. They approached her while she was barely able to stand. At the time, she thought they were helping. Instead, they led her away from the party and into a vehicle. From that point forward, her memory came in broken pieces. She remembered the inside of a car, the sound of doors closing, someone laughing, the city lights passing outside the window while she tried to stay conscious. They took her to an apartment. There she was, held for days. She was repeatedly drugged so she couldn't fully resist. The men assaulted her again and again. When they were finished, they locked her inside a small room. The room had almost nothing inside it. No bed, no furniture, just a bucket they forced her to use as a bathroom. She lost track of time quickly. Without windows or clocks, days blended together. She didn't know if anyone was searching for her or if the outside world had already forgotten. At one point, she said she thought she might die there. But eventually, a moment came that changed everything. After another assault, one of the men injected her with heroin to keep her weak and quiet. She was barely conscious, but she forced herself to focus. She knew if she didn't try something soon, she might never leave that room alive. She convinced one of the men to let her use the real bathroom so she could clean herself. She later said she didn't know how she managed to say the right words. She only knew that in that moment she had to try. The man eventually agreed. Inside the bathroom there was a small window. It faced the outside of the building. While the shower ran, masking sound, she forced herself toward that window. Her arm and leg were already injured, but adrenaline pushed her forward. The opening was tight. She had to twist her body painfully to squeeze through. For a moment, she thought she might get stuck. Then she fell. It was a 3-story drop. She landed in a large hedge below the building. The branches tore at her clothes and skin, but they also softened the impact enough to keep her alive. The fall made her injuries worse. But she was outside, and outside meant there was still hope. She crawled out of the bushes and onto the grass. Every movement sent waves of pain through her body. Her broken arm barely worked. Her leg dragged behind her. Still, she kept moving. She crawled across the apartment complex lawn, then across the sidewalk, then slowly toward the road. Eventually, she reached the bus stop. That was where the homeless man saw her. The moment people began stopping and gathering around her was the moment her captors lost their chance to bring her back inside. Police later used nearby surveillance cameras to track the path she had crawled and identify the apartment building she escaped from. 3 men were eventually arrested. The legal process took a long time. Court hearings, investigations, testimony. It was painful for everyone involved, especially for her. Recovery took even longer. She didn't return to our university for almost 2 years. When she finally did come back, she was different. The easy laughter she once had was gone. In its place was a kind of quiet alertness. She watched people carefully. She paid attention to every room she entered. Her movements were calm but cautious, like someone who had learned through experience how quickly a situation could turn dangerous. She never went to another party, not once. She carried a gun anywhere she legally could. She checked exits when entering buildings. She trusted only a small number of people, but she kept going. She finished her degree, and eventually she became a nurse. For those of us who had known her before everything happened, the change was impossible not to notice. She had survived something most people could barely imagine, but she had also refused to disappear. The story never really left the people who knew her during that time. Whenever we think back to those years, the memory of those 10 days always returns. The empty feeling around campus, the flyers on every wall, the quiet fear that something terrible had happened. She was only 18 years old when it happened, and even now, years later, none of us have ever forgotten her story. A while back, a group of girls from my friend circle decided to go out together for the night. They wanted one of those simple, badly needed evenings where nobody had to think too hard about anything. Just music, dancing, a few drinks, and the temporary relief that comes from being young enough to believe one good night out can wash a whole week off your shoulders. They chose a local gay club, mostly because it had a reputation for being safer than most places in town. Women liked going there because the atmosphere usually felt different, less aggressive, less predatory, more relaxed. People went there to have fun and be themselves, and the staff didn't tolerate much nonsense. Compared to other clubs, it felt like one of the few places where you could let your guard down a little. For some reason, I didn't go with them that night. I honestly don't remember why. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I had work the next morning. Maybe I just didn't feel like going out. At the time, it was probably a forgettable decision, one of those tiny choices that means nothing while you're making it. Looking back now, it feels heavier than it should. Part of me is relieved I wasn't there, because what happened sounded terrifying, even secondhand. But another part of me wishes I had gone. I wish I had been there to help, to back them up, to share the burden of what they had to do. Even now, that feeling hasn't fully gone away. From what they told me, the night started out completely normal. The club was crowded but not suffocatingly packed. Music was loud enough to make conversation annoying, but not impossible if you leaned close. Lights flashed over the dance floor in shifting colors. People were laughing, moving, spilling drinks, shouting into each other's ears, doing all the ordinary things people do when they've come out to forget themselves for a few hours. My friends were on the dance floor when they noticed her. At first, what caught their attention wasn't anything dramatic. It was just that she looked wrong for the setting. Everyone else around her looked like they had prepared to go out. People had dressed up. They had done their makeup, picked their outfits, styled their hair. Even in a casual club, there is usually a certain effort people make. They want to feel attractive, bold, noticeable, or at the very least, like they belong there. This girl didn't look like she belonged there at all. She was wearing plain sweatpants and a t-shirt, not stylish sweatpants. Not one of those outfits designed to look casual on purpose. Just ordinary sweatpants, the kind you wear to stay home, run errands, or Go to class when you don't care how you look. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wasn't wearing makeup. She had a backpack still strapped to her shoulders, which made the whole thing even stranger. Nobody brings a backpack onto a dance floor unless they have a reason. It was such an odd sight that my friends noticed her right away. At first, one of them even thought maybe she had just come in to meet someone and would leave again. But the longer they watched, the worse it felt. It wasn't just the clothes, it was her face. She looked dazed, not relaxed, not carefree, not even drunk in the loose, messy way people in clubs often are. Her eyes weren't focusing properly. She wasn't really dancing, not in any meaningful sense. She was just kind of standing there in the middle of all that noise and movement, swaying a little as if her body was trying to keep itself upright without much help from her mind. There was no expression on her face that matched the room around her. No laughter, no irritation, no embarrassment, nothing. And there was a man pressed up against her. He was much bigger than she was. Broad, heavy, physically imposing in the way some men are even when they aren't trying. According to my friends, he had his hands all over her, not casually, not the way a boyfriend or partner might touch someone they came with. He was grabbing at her waist, grinding against her, moving her body more than she was moving it herself. What made it instantly alarming was that she wasn't reacting. She wasn't leaning into him, wasn't smiling, wasn't touching him back. But she also wasn't pushing him away. She looked like someone whose body was present while the rest of her was somewhere far away. That was the moment my friends stopped seeing it as just something odd and started seeing it as something dangerous. One of them decided to approach her. She didn't want to escalate things right away, so she tried to keep it casual. She moved closer through the crowd, smiling in that friendly way women often do when they're trying not to alarm someone, and asked the girl if she was okay. Before the girl could even answer, the man answered for her. That alone set off a fresh wave of alarm. He immediately stepped in, like he had been waiting for the chance. He said the girl was his girlfriend. He said she had too much to drink. He said she was fine. His tone wasn't just firm, it was defensive and controlling, as if the question itself had offended him. He didn't glance at the girl to see whether she wanted to speak. He didn't let her respond. He inserted himself between them and made it clear that access to her would go through him. My friend backed off, but only on the surface. None of them believed him. It wasn't just what he said. It was how quickly he said it, how sharply, how possessive he seemed over someone who looked barely able to stand. If she really was his girlfriend and she was simply drunk, his behavior still would have been off. But paired with the girl's condition, it felt much worse than that. So they stayed nearby. They pretended to go back to dancing, but they kept watching. They made sure not to lose sight of the man or the girl. The longer they observed them, the more unsettled they became. He kept guiding her physically, steering her with a hand on her arm or lower back. He leaned in and whispered to her. Sometimes he said things and she barely reacted at all. She looked less like a drunk person enjoying a bad night out, and more like someone fading in and out of awareness. One of my friends later said that was what scared her most. Drunk people are usually still present in some way. They laugh too hard, stumble, get emotional, say things they don't mean, cling to their friends, get sick, argue, cry. This girl wasn't doing any of that. She just seemed vacant, like someone had emptied her out and left only enough behind for her body to keep moving. Then the man went to the bar. It was such a small, ordinary thing, but my friends knew immediately that it was their chance. The second he stepped away, one of them moved fast. She went straight back to the girl and started talking to her again, more directly this time. Up close, it was even worse than it had looked from a distance. The girl struggled to focus on her face. Her words came slowly. She seemed confused, disoriented, and exhausted in a way that didn't match simple drinking. My friend kept her voice gentle and clear. She asked her name. She asked if she knew the man. She asked if she needed help. The girl took time to answer each question, like her brain had to travel a long distance before it could reach her mouth. What she managed to say was enough. She said she didn't know him. She said she hadn't come there with him, and she said she wanted to leave. That was all my friend needed to hear. There was no longer any doubt. No need to wonder whether they were misunderstanding the situation or reading too much into it. Something was wrong, seriously wrong, and whatever hesitation had existed before disappeared instantly. My friend took her by the hand and slipped an arm around her to support her. The girl was unsteady enough that she had trouble walking on her own. The plan was simple because it had to be simple. Get her out. Get her into fresh air. Put distance between her and that man. Sort out the details somewhere safer. For a few seconds, it almost worked. They started making their way through the crowd toward the exit. Another one of my friends moved with them, trying to create a kind of buffer. But clubs are noisy, chaotic places. You can only move so fast through bodies and lights, and spilled drinks, and people who have no idea something terrible may be happening 2 feet away from them. Before they reached the door, the man returned from the bar. The moment he saw them, he understood what was happening, and he exploded. From what my friend told me, the change in him was instant and frightening. Any fake calm he had shown before was gone. He rushed toward them, got right in her face and started screaming. He accused her of kidnapping. He shouted that the girl was his girlfriend. He demanded that she let go of her immediately. He was so loud and so aggressive that for a moment it seemed to distort the whole space around them, like all the air had been sucked out of the room. My friend tried to stay calm. She kept hold of the girl and told him to back off. But he got closer instead. His face was inches from hers. He was spitting as he yelled. His body language had changed from controlling to openly violent, and everyone could feel it. People nearby started noticing, but that didn't mean they understood what they were seeing. In a club, confrontation can look like a drunken argument until it suddenly turns into something worse. Music was still pounding, lights were still flashing. The whole scene had that unreal feeling public danger often has, where normal life keeps moving around it as if nothing is wrong. Then he swung at her. It happened fast enough that she barely had time to react. Instinct more than thought made her move. The punch missed her by inches. If she had been half a second slower, he would have hit her square in the face. That was the moment the situation tipped from threatening to openly dangerous. Thankfully, one of the others had already gone for security. A guard arrived just in time. He stepped in between them and shoved the man back before he could swing again. More staff came quickly after that. Once the spell of confusion broke, the whole club seemed to wake up at once. Suddenly, people were watching, shifting aside, realizing something serious was happening. The man kept yelling, kept trying to push forward, but security was able to restrain him and pull him away from my friends. That intervention probably prevented something much worse. While security was focused on him, my friends did the smartest thing they could have done. They didn't stay to argue. They didn't wait to explain themselves. They didn't trust that the situation was truly under control. They took the girl and left immediately. Outside, the night air hit them all at once. The girl could barely walk. They had to help support most of her weight as they moved her away from the entrance and toward the car. Up close, outside the noise and strobing lights, it was obvious how impaired she really was. Her skin looked pale. Her eyes were heavy and unfocused. She seemed only partly aware of what was going on around her. They got her into the car and tried to talk to her more. It was difficult. She still couldn't explain clearly how she had gotten there or what had happened earlier in the day. Her thoughts kept slipping away from her, but she managed to say one thing that made all of it even more frightening. She said the man had been following her around town all day, not just at the club, all day. That changed the story completely. Until then, there had still been a narrow possibility, at least from the outside, that he had met her somewhere earlier and was taking advantage of someone who was vulnerable in the moment. That would have been bad enough. But if he had been following her for hours, then this was something else. It meant he had targeted her, watched her, waited. It meant his presence beside her in that club was not chance or misunderstanding. It was the result of deliberate pursuit. And if that was true, then he had likely seen something in her earlier that day and decided she was someone he could isolate, manipulate, and control. That thought still makes me sick. Eventually, my friends were able to get the girl somewhere safe and connect her with people she trusted. Even that part was messy and frightening because she was still not fully coherent and they had to make judgment calls quickly. But they did not leave her alone, and they did not let her disappear back into the night with someone she said she did not know. That should have been the end of it. But what happened afterward made the whole thing worse in a quieter, more lasting way. Once my friends had left with the girl, there was very little the bar staff could actually do beyond removing the man from the club and banning him from returning. Since the girl herself had not filed a complaint in that moment, and since she was gone by then, the staff's power stopped at the door. They could protect people inside their building. They could throw him out, but they could not make him disappear. One of my friends did call the police and gave them a description of him. The response was deeply frustrating. From what she was told, there wasn't much immediate action they could take without a formal complaint from the girl herself. They said they would keep an eye out. They said they understood the concern. But concern is not the same as action, and action was what everyone wanted. So in the end, that was it. He was removed from the club, and then he was simply back out on the street. That is the part that has stayed with me the longest, longer even than the image of him on the dance floor with that dazed girl. The idea that someone could behave that aggressively, look that obviously dangerous, throw a punch in public, and still end the night walking away into the dark is hard to sit with. There was nothing to guarantee he would not do it again. Nothing to guarantee he wasn't already doing it regularly. Nothing to guarantee that the next woman he targeted would be noticed in time. That is what makes the whole story feel so heavy even now. Not just what happened, but how close it came to something worse. If my friends had looked at that girl and decided it was none of their business, what then? If they had accepted the man's explanation because it was easier than risking an awkward confrontation, what then? If they had worried more about making a scene than about being wrong, what then? Predators depend on that hesitation. They depend on people wanting to stay polite. They depend on crowds being noisy and distracted. They depend on the fact that most people don't want to step into a situation unless they are absolutely sure. And by the time anyone is absolutely sure, it is often too late. That night drove that lesson home for all of us, in a way none of us forgot. If something feels wrong, it probably is. If someone looks like they need help, they probably do. And sometimes stepping in is frightening, uncomfortable, and dangerous, but still necessary. My friends were not superheroes. They were just women on a night out who paid attention when everyone else could have ignored what they were seeing. They trusted the sick feeling in their stomachs. They noticed details that didn't fit. They acted when action still mattered. And because of that, a girl who might have vanished into a terrible night got home safe instead. The most unsettling part is knowing that the man is probably still out there somewhere, part of the ordinary world, moving through crowds, looking normal until he doesn't. That is what truly stays with me. Not the club itself, not the shouting, not even the punch. It's the knowledge that evil doesn't always arrive with obvious signs. Sometimes it just stands too close to someone who cannot quite stand on her own. Sometimes it answers for her before she can speak. Sometimes it counts on everyone nearby deciding not to interfere. And sometimes the only thing standing between a predator and the person he has chosen is whether someone else is willing to trust their instincts and step forward anyway. Before I explain what happened, there's something important to understand about the situation I was in at the time. I was 23 years old, living alone for the first time in my life. I wasn't particularly strong, I didn't know any kind of self-defense, and I had never been in a situation where I genuinely felt like my safety was in danger. That lack of experience made everything feel larger and more frightening than it might have been otherwise. Not long before that night, I had gone through a breakup. My ex and I had been living together in a 3-bedroom, 1.5-bath house. When the relationship ended, he moved out. Suddenly, that house, which had once felt normal and comfortable, became a place that seemed far too big for one person. I stayed there with our animals, telling myself that everything was fine. I kept repeating that I was an adult and that plenty of people lived alone without being afraid. But the truth was that I was already a little on edge. Every sound in the house felt louder when I was by myself. The creaking of the floors at night made me pause and listen. The wind against the siding sometimes made me sit up in bed. I found myself checking the locks on the doors more often than I ever had before. Still, I tried not to let those feelings control me. I told myself that the anxiety would fade once I got used to the new routine. That night, everything felt normal when I went to bed. The house was quiet. The animals were settled. I remember lying there thinking that maybe I was finally adjusting to living alone. Maybe the nervousness was starting to pass. Sometime around 2 in the morning, I was suddenly pulled out of sleep. My dog jumped off the bed. Not slowly, not in that lazy way dogs sometimes stretch and climb down. She launched herself off the mattress and ran across the room like something had scared her. Then she started barking. Not her usual bark. This was loud, frantic, aggressive barking, the kind that instantly wakes you up because something about it sounds wrong. I shot upright in bed, still half asleep and completely confused. Before I could even ask what was going on, I heard something else. Leaves crunching outside my bedroom window. My bedroom faced the yard, and hearing that sound in the middle of the night made my stomach drop immediately. It was too deliberate to be the wind, and too heavy to be a small animal moving through the bushes. Then came another sound. Someone tapped on the window. At first, it was light, almost cautious. I froze. I didn't move or speak. I just sat there in the darkness listening, trying to convince myself that maybe I had imagined it. The tapping came again. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. My dog ran toward the window, barking wildly. She threw herself at the wall beneath it, growling in a way I had never heard before. It wasn't playful or curious. It was angry and protective. That alone told me something was wrong. The tapping continued. Whoever was outside kept hitting the glass in steady, insistent knocks, like they were trying to get someone's attention. The sound felt endless. In reality, it probably lasted only a couple of minutes, but when you're sitting alone in the dark listening to someone tap on your bedroom window, time stretches in a horrible way. But my mind raced through every possible explanation. Maybe it was a neighbor. Maybe someone needed help. Maybe it was someone drunk who had the wrong house. But none of those thoughts made the fear go away, because the tapping didn't stop. It kept getting harder, more demanding. Meanwhile, my dog was barking so violently I thought she might break the glass trying to get to whoever was outside. Every instinct in my body told me the same thing. Someone was standing right outside my bedroom. For what felt like forever, I stayed frozen on the bed. Then adrenaline took over. I grabbed my phone, jumped up, and ran out of the bedroom. I didn't even think about turning on lights. I just wanted distance between myself and that window. I ended up standing in the living room, shaking so badly that I could barely hold the phone. That was when I heard another sound. There are 2 entrances to my house. One is the front door. The other is a door off the kitchen. From the kitchen area, I heard someone grabbing the doorknob, not knocking, trying to open it. The knob twisted violently back and forth. Then I heard the sound of someone slamming their body against the door, again and again. Whoever was outside was trying to force their way inside. I cannot fully describe the fear that hit me at that moment. My entire body went cold. My hands shook so badly that my phone almost slipped out of my grip. My thoughts were spinning, jumping from one terrible possibility to another. I didn't know if I should hide, run, scream, or call for help. My first instinct wasn't even the police. I called my girlfriend. She was my new girlfriend, the one I started seeing after the breakup. I woke her up in a panic and tried to explain what was happening. I was crying and talking so fast that half my words didn't make sense. I remember shouting into the phone, "What do I do? What do I do?" She woke up instantly. The moment she understood what I was saying, her voice changed from sleepy to terrified. "What the hell?" she said. "Call the police. Call them right now." As soon as I hung up and started dialing 911, the noise at the kitchen door suddenly stopped. For a moment, the silence felt worse than the banging. Then I saw him. Through the kitchen window, I saw a man standing outside. He was close to the glass, looking into the house. Our eyes met. That moment is burned into my memory. I felt like I might throw up. My stomach dropped so hard I almost lost control of my bladder from sheer panic. I had never seen this man before in my life, yet he was standing there in the middle of the night, staring directly at me through my window. His expression wasn't calm. He looked furious. Then he moved. He rounded the corner of the house toward the front door and immediately started trying to force that one open too. I could hear the doorknob rattling violently. Then the pounding started again. He slammed his hands against the door, then his body, and he was yelling, loud, angry shouting that I couldn't understand. The words were slurred together into something that sounded more like rage than language. By then I had finally reached the emergency dispatcher. I was crying and shaking so badly that it was difficult to speak clearly. I told her someone was trying to break into my house, that I was alone and that he was yelling and trying to break down the doors. She stayed calm. She told me a patrol car was already nearby and officers were on their way. Then she told me to get somewhere safe and stay inside. I didn't waste a second. I ran back into my bedroom, pulled my dog with me and locked the door. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, holding my dog tightly while she continued to growl and bark toward the hallway. Every sound made me jump. I was certain that at any moment I would hear glass breaking or a door splintering open. Then suddenly everything stopped. The yelling, the banging, all of it. The silence felt terrifying. I stayed in that room for several minutes, barely breathing, too afraid to move. Eventually I forced myself to stand up and peek through the hallway toward the front of the house. I expected to see police lights flashing through the windows, but there was nothing. No officers, no man, just darkness. About 30 minutes later, my phone rang. It was a police officer calling to explain what had happened. They had already located the man. According to the officer, he was extremely drunk. He had mistaken my house for his own. He believed his wife had locked him out, which was why he was yelling and trying to force his way inside. Hearing that explanation didn't comfort me at all. If anything, it made the whole situation feel worse. Drunk people don't think clearly. They don't act rationally. And when someone is angry and confused at the same time, things can turn violent very quickly. The fact that he thought I was his wife made my stomach twist. If he had gotten inside and found me there instead, a frightened stranger half his size, I have no idea how that situation would have ended. Maybe nothing would have happened, or maybe something terrible would have. I'll never know. What I do know is that my doors were locked, and that simple habit probably saved me. That night changed something in me. After that, I stopped feeling silly for being cautious. I trusted my instincts more. I stopped brushing off fear as weakness and started recognizing that sometimes fear is your mind trying to protect you. Even now, years later, I still think about that moment sometimes. The tapping on the window, my dog barking like she had never barked before, the man's face staring through the kitchen glass. And every single night, without exception, I lock my doors before I go to sleep. Before my father died, he told me a story he had never shared openly in his life. He told it once, near the end, in a voice so calm and matter-of-fact that it made the whole thing harder to dismiss. He was not a dramatic man. He was not the kind of man who embroidered details or chased mystery or told a story in a way that asked for attention. He spoke carefully, as if he had spent years deciding whether the memory belonged in silence or in words, and only at the very end had chosen words. He carried it for decades. My father served in Vietnam in the 1960s. He was part of a small American team that worked alongside CIDG strikers, South Vietnamese irregulars trained to scout, guide, and fight in areas where ordinary units would be at a disadvantage. He respected those men deeply. He said they could read the jungle the way other people read a road sign. They noticed what had changed, what had been disturbed, what did not belong. They knew how to move without announcing themselves to every living thing in the forest. American patrols depended on them more than most people back home ever understood. The mission he described to me was not one of the loud ones people imagine when they think of war. It was not a firefight, not a helicopter assault, not the kind of event that turns into medals and newspaper lines. It was quiet work, the kind of work that could kill you just as easily. His team had been sent to place seismic ground sensors along a network of jungle trails used by enemy troops. The sensors were meant to pick up movement. If enough of them were set in the right places, commanders could learn where men and supplies were moving through the jungle and how often. It was useful work, but slow and exposed. You moved deep into contested ground, carried delicate equipment, and had to spend long stretches of time staying still in places where staying still could get you killed. He told me the patrol was small. 2 Americans, including him, and 5 CIDG strikers. By the time the incident happened, they had already been in the field for about 2 days. 2 days in that environment was enough to wear a man down in ways difficult to explain to anyone who has never lived under constant tension. The jungle did not simply tire you physically. It worked on your nerves. Your clothes stayed wet. Your skin never felt clean. Your ears adjusted to 1,000 small sounds and learned to treat them all as possible warnings. Even when nothing was happening, you could never fully relax because nothing happening was often when something began. He said the heat was constant, heavy, and close. Even in the shade, it clung to you. Sweat soaked everything. Your socks stayed damp. Your rifle sling rubbed raw spots into your shoulder and neck. Insects found you no matter how careful you were. Leeches got into places that made you curse under your breath. Sometimes the jungle smelled green and alive. Sometimes it smelled rotten, like wet leaves and stagnant water and things breaking down in the heat. And behind all of it was the knowledge that men were moving through that same jungle, with rifles, mines, and orders of their own. On that particular day, the team reached an area where several narrow trails crossed. It was exactly the kind of place worth watching. And trails like that were arteries. Men moved through them. Supplies moved through them. Intelligence moved through them, though no one called it that in the field. You learned quickly that a trail intersection meant possibility, and possibility in war was rarely good news. The rest of the patrol planned to continue farther out and place more sensors. My father, along with 2 of the CIDG strikers, split off to observe a nearby crossing for a while, before deciding whether it was safe to go farther or wiser to pull back and rejoined the others. It was a simple enough plan. Watch the trail, listen, make sure the area was clear, then move. They chose positions in thick brush near the intersection and settled in. He said the jungle that day felt unusually calm, not silent because the jungle was never truly silent, but settled. See, he could hear insects humming in the undergrowth. Somewhere up in the trees, monkeys shifted and barked now and then. Birds called in the distance, leaves stirred overhead. There were no gunshots, no distant artillery, no voices, no sign of enemy movement. Just the ordinary sound of a place too alive to ever be still. They stayed there for hours. Time did strange things on watch. My father said that was one of the first hard lessons he learned in war. Minutes could drag so badly they felt physical. You could become convinced an hour had passed, and then look down and realize it had only been 7 minutes. Then somehow an entire afternoon would vanish, while you scanned the same patch of trail again and again, checking shadows, branches, and bends in the path for anything that did not belong. They watched carefully. One striker covered one approach, the other watched the opposite side. My father kept his eyes on the crossing itself and the nearby tree line. Nobody spoke above a whisper. Now and then they used small hand signals. Mostly they just waited. Nothing happened. After several hours, the strain began to ease just enough for practical thoughts to return. Maybe they had chosen a dead stretch of trail. Maybe traffic had shifted elsewhere. Maybe the safest choice was to move a little farther down, place another sensor, then circle back and reconnect with the main group. Eventually, they began quietly discussing what to do next. It was the kind of conversation men in the field have without really moving their lips. A few murmured words, a look, a gesture. Agreement arrived in pieces. They would go a bit farther, cautiously, and then make their way back. Before stepping out from cover, my father did what training had taught him to do every single time. He checked the trail again. He leaned forward slightly in the brush and studied the crossing one last time. Ground, tree line, shadows, the places where a man might be lying still, the spots where a tripwire might hide. He signaled the 2 strikers to get ready, but not to move until he gave the word. That was when something caught his eye. At first he thought his mind had made a mistake. Lying along the edge of the trail, near enough to the crossing that he was certain the man had not been there a moment earlier, was a soldier. Not North Vietnamese, not American. Just a soldier, impossibly out of place. My father said the confusion hit him before fear did. The figure looked wrong for the war, wrong for the jungle, wrong even for the century. He was a light-skinned black man dressed in what looked to my father like an old military uniform from another era. Not modern fatigues, not French colonial gear, not any Allied or enemy uniform my father had ever seen in manuals, photographs, or in the field. The cut of it was older. The whole look of the man belonged to a different time. He was fully armed. That was one of the details my father remembered most clearly. 2 pistols, one carried on each side, a Spencer rifle, and at his hip, a short, curved club that my father recognized at once as a Native American war club. He knew the Spencer because his grandfather had collected old firearms, and my father had spent enough boyhood afternoons looking at them to know one when he saw one. That was part of what made the sight so impossible. It was not simply an old-looking rifle. It was a specific rifle from a specific period of history. The same was true of the club. The whole arrangement was too exact to feel like a random dream image tossed up by exhaustion. For one brief second, he thought he might be hallucinating. He was tired. He had been living in heat and fear. Men under that kind of strain saw strange things sometimes. Not always full apparitions, but movements in the wrong shadows. Shapes that dissolved into vines. Faces where there were only leaves. He knew that. Every man in that war knew that. Fatigue played tricks. Stress dug under the skin. Dehydration, hunger, adrenaline, all of it could make the mind misfire. But this did not feel like a misfire. The soldier was too clear. So he was not shimmering at the edge of vision. He was not vague. He had detail. My father could see the shape of his equipment, the angle of the rifle, the set of his shoulders. The man looked relaxed but alert, as if he belonged exactly where he was and had never once questioned it. Then the soldier turned his head and looked directly at him. My father said that what never left him, what stayed clearer than the rifle or the pistols or the strange uniform, was the expression on the man's face. He smiled. Not in a threatening way, not in a wild way. It was a calm, almost familiar smile, the kind one soldier might give another when both understand something without needing to say it. There was nothing theatrical about it, nothing ghostly, just a quiet assurance that seemed to say, "I see you, be still." The man raised one finger and placed it gently to his lips. Silence. Then he made a small motion with his other hand, palm low, urging my father to move back into the brush and away from the trail. My father told me he did not stop to weigh possibilities. He did not wonder if this was real or imagined. Some combination of training and instinct took over. He gave a small signal to the two strikers to hold their position and stay hidden. Then he eased backward into the brush, slow and careful, every muscle controlled. As he moved, he saw the old soldier do the same thing on the opposite side of the trail. That was another detail he never forgot. The man mirrored him, not clumsily, not by coincidence. He slipped back into the jungle with the same quiet precision, as if they were part of the same patrol on opposite sides of the same path, working in perfect understanding without a word spoken between them. Then, less than 10 seconds later, the jungle answered the question my father hadn't dared ask. Enemy soldiers appeared on the trail. The lead element of a North Vietnamese unit came through the far approach and crossed the intersection at close range, maybe 30 feet away. My father said they moved with discipline, weapons carried ready, eyes forward, no talking, no hesitation. The sort of movement that told you they had done this many times and expected trouble at any moment. And they kept coming. Not 5 men, not 10, dozens. My father estimated there were at least 70, maybe 80 soldiers in the column. Enough rifles, machine guns, and grenades to erase his little team in seconds if they had stepped out onto that trail when they had been preparing to move. There would have been no dramatic stand, no chance to fight free. At that range, with that many enemy troops, and only 3 men exposed at the crossing, it would have been a slaughter. The best outcome would have been dying quickly. The worst did not need naming, so they stayed perfectly still. My father pressed himself into the brush and became, in his own words, less than a man. He became breath, dirt, and patience. Beside him, the 2 strikers did the same. The jungle around them seemed to narrow until it held only the passing feet of enemy soldiers, the sound of equipment brushing cloth, the quiet thud of boots in the packed earth. He could see faces. That was how close they were. Young men, hard men, tired men. Men who had no idea death had almost stepped into the trail in front of them. Men who had no idea they themselves had almost walked into an ambush if things had broken a little differently. War is like that. Everyone imagines their own version of near disaster and never knows the shape of the other one. The column passed through the intersection and continued on. One line after another, weapons, packs, sweat-dark uniforms, then more of them. It seemed to go on forever. My father said his legs cramped, and still he did not move. He could hear blood in his ears. He could feel insects on his skin and could not lift a hand to brush them away. At some point he wanted to glance across the trail and check whether the old soldier was still there. He did not. He was too disciplined, too afraid. none too busy staying alive to risk the movement. He kept his eyes where they needed to be and waited for the last man to disappear into the jungle. Only after the tail of the unit had gone and enough time had passed for safety to feel possible did he allow himself to breathe more fully. The trail was empty again. The jungle resumed around it, almost offensively normal. Birds, insects, leaves, nothing to suggest what had just moved through, nothing to explain the man who had warned him. My father looked for the soldier then. There was no sign of him, no movement in the brush across the trail, no retreating figure, no shape slipping between the trees. Nothing. As soon as it was safe, my father signaled the strikers, and they pulled back carefully, moving away from the crossing and rejoining the rest of the patrol as quietly and quickly as they could. Once they were with the others, he reported what mattered in military terms. A large enemy unit had passed through the intersection, direction of movement, estimated numbers, weapons observed. That information needed to go up the chain. It could affect operations, sensor placement, maybe even save other men farther down the line. But he did not say one word about the old soldier, not to the other American on the patrol, not to the CIDG strikers, not to his superiors when the report was eventually passed along, not later when men sat cleaning rifles or eating bad rations or smoking in the dark and swapping stories about close calls. He kept that part to himself. He told me he learned quickly in the military, especially in war, i.e. that some experiences did not belong in official language. Reports were for facts that could be mapped, counted, or acted on. You did not insert a man from another century into an after-action account. You did not say a Civil War scout appeared in the jungle and silently warned you off a trail seconds before an enemy column arrived. Even if men believed you, what then? There were no forms for that. No procedures, only questions you could not answer and looks you would remember. So he said nothing. Years passed. He came home. He built a life. He worked. He raised a family. He carried the memory of that trail intersection like a sealed object inside himself. It was not that he forgot it. It was that he kept it in a place where it would not disturb the rest of what he had managed to build. Many men who came back from war learned some version of that skill, whether what they buried was supernatural or not. He told me the first person he ever spoke of it to was his grandmother. That happened in the 1970s when she was close to dying. He visited her, and for reasons he could not fully explain even to himself, the story came out. Maybe death makes certain kinds of truth easier. Maybe he had begun to feel that if he never told anyone, the event itself would become unreal, even to him. Maybe he simply trusted her in a way that made explanation unnecessary. He described the soldier exactly as he had seen him, the old-fashioned uniform, the 2 pistols, the Spencer rifle, the war club, the smile. His grandmother listened with her eyes closed. When he finished, she did not laugh. She did not ask whether he had been exhausted, frightened, or mistaken. She did not demand proof or offer easy comfort. According to my father, she smiled softly and said, "You saw old Red Tom." That was the first time he heard the name. Red Tom, she told him, was his great-great-grandfather. He had been a free man, half black and half Creek, born long before my father. During the Civil War, he served as a scout for the Union. He knew how to move through country without being seen. He knew how to read ground, pick up signs, and warn others of danger. Later, she said, he served with the U.S. Cavalry in the West. Whether every detail of that family history could be verified in a record book, I do not know. Families pass down truth in a mixture of fact and reverence. What mattered was this. The man in the jungle matched the family story in every important detail. He was known, she said, for carrying 2 pistols, a Spencer rifle, and a Creek war club. The exact weapons my father had seen. That part shook him more than if she had reacted with fear. If she had doubted him, he could have folded the memory back into silence and gone on. If she had been startled, he could have treated the whole thing as an old woman humoring a tired veteran. But she acted as though she recognized the event instantly, as though the world had briefly behaved according to an old family logic he had never been told. You saw Old Red Tom. Nothing in my father's account suggested his grandmother found that impossible. After telling her, he never spoke of it again for years. He did not turn it into a family legend. He did not bring it up at holidays. He did not sit me down as a boy and tell me we came from people who crossed centuries to protect their own. He simply returned to silence. Perhaps having put the story into words once was enough. Perhaps it became too sacred to use casually. Perhaps he feared that repetition would cheapen it. Then, near the end of his life, he told me, "I remember the room. I remember the light. I remember the way his voice changed as he moved through the story, not becoming theatrical, but becoming younger somehow, sharpened by memory. For that stretch of time, he was not only my aging father, he was also the young man in the jungle, hidden in the brush, watching a trail and trying not to breathe. He did not ask whether I believed him. That was one of the things that convinced me more than any detail could have. He did not try to persuade. He did not lean on me emotionally. He did not say, 'You have to understand,' or swear you believe me. He simply told me what happened in the order it happened and left the weight of it where it belonged. That was his way with truth. He believed in facts, discipline, and reality. He was not a man prone to fantasy. If anything, he was too suspicious of fantasy. He distrusted exaggeration in other people and in himself. He could be tender, but he was not sentimental. He could be funny, but he had no taste for performance. The older I get, the more I understand how rare that kind of plain honesty is, and how unsettling it becomes when a person like that tells you something the world has no comfortable place for. I have thought about that story many times since he died, not always in the same way. But some days I think about the practical facts of it, and those alone are chilling enough. A small reconnaissance element in the jungle, a trail crossing, a final glance before stepping out, an enemy force so large it would have destroyed them immediately. It would only have taken a few more seconds, one more step onto the trail, one small noise in the brush, and I would not exist. My father would have died there among strangers in a war that had already taken too much from too many. Other days I think about the smile, not because it was frightening, but because it was not. If my father had described terror or some grotesque apparition or the kind of thing horror stories rely on, I might know where to place it. Fear has familiar shapes, but what he described was something harder to dismiss: calm recognition. A warning offered not in panic but in quiet assurance. The behavior of someone who knew both the danger and the man he was protecting. And then there are the days I think about bloodline, about how strange it is that in the middle of a war on the other side of the world, a young American soldier in the jungle might have been warned by an ancestor who had once scouted battlefields a century earlier. If that is what happened, then whatever separates the living from the dead, the past from the present, and memory from presence is thinner than most of us want to believe. I do not know what my father saw. I cannot prove it. I cannot measure it. I cannot offer documents that would satisfy a historian or a scientist. The world likes evidence that can be held in the hand. This story offers none. It lives in the memory of a man who had every reason to remain silent and almost did. But I know my father. That has to count for something. I know the kind of man he was. I know how he spoke when he was unsure, and how he spoke when he was certain. I know the difference between the face he wore when telling a funny story and the face he wore when saying something that had cost him something to carry. When he told me about the jungle, he was not reliving a dream or reciting family folklore. He was remembering an event. Whether Red Tom was a ghost, a guardian, a trick of time, or something beyond all of those words, I cannot say. Maybe names do not matter as much as intention. Whatever stood on that trail knew danger was seconds away. Whatever stood there chose to warn my father. Whatever stood there moved with him, hid with him, and then disappeared once the danger had passed. There is something deeply unsettling in that, but there is something merciful too. War stories are usually full of loss. Even the ones that end in survival often carry a kind of damage that never truly heals. My father had those stories too, though he told very few of them. But this one was different. It was a war story in which something old and impossible entered the violence of the world for one brief moment and turned death aside. He did not build a philosophy around it. He did not become mystical afterward. He did not claim that the dead always watch over us or that ancestry grants protection. He simply accepted that something happened which did not fit the ordinary shape of reality and continued living anyway. Maybe that is what I find most haunting, not the apparition itself, but the restraint that followed. He was saved by something he could not explain, and he did not spend the rest of his life trying to explain it. He let the mystery remain a mystery. He gave it the dignity of truth without pretending that truth had to become understanding. I have tried to do the same. Still, there are nights when I imagine that trail crossing in detail. The thick brush, the heat, the smell of wet earth and plant rot, the insects, my father leaning forward for one last look before stepping out. The impossible sight of a soldier from another century lying along the trail, as if he had been there all along. The quiet motion of a finger to the lips, the warning hand, the mirrored retreat into the jungle, then the enemy column appearing, one man after another, more and more until the small hidden team must have felt the full size of the death they had just escaped. And somewhere in that image, always, is the smile. Not triumphant, not eerie, just familiar, as though for one moment in the middle of war, my father was not alone in the jungle at all. That may be the detail I return to most. If the story were only about danger avoided, it would already be remarkable. But it is also about recognition, about being seen, about some part of the past seeing a man who did not yet know he needed help and stepping close enough to offer it. I cannot make anyone else believe that. I am not even sure belief is the right word. Some stories do not demand belief so much as honesty about the limits of our explanations. All I know is this: without that warning, my father almost certainly would have stepped onto that trail. Without that warning, he would have died in Vietnam. Without that warning, I would not be here to tell this story now. That is the plainest fact in it. Everything beyond that is mystery. Maybe it was a ghost. Maybe it was an ancestor keeping an old promise that family would never fully understand. Maybe the jungle, war, blood, and fear opened some narrow seam in reality and allowed one scout from one century to guide another from the next. I do not know. But when my father spoke of it near the end of his life, there was no confusion in him. Only memory, only certainty. He had seen the man, he had followed the warning, he had lived. And somewhere in the strange, dark intersection between history and family, between battlefield and bloodline, old Red Tom had stepped out of another age just long enough to save one of his own. My mom told me this story years ago, but it has never really left my mind. It's the kind of story that stays with you long after you hear it, not because it's dramatic or filled with sudden shocks, but because of how quiet it is. The frightening part isn't a single moment. It's the slow realization of what was happening the entire time without anyone knowing. What makes it even stranger for me is that the place where it happened is somewhere I know very well. My mom and I both went to university in the same city, just many years apart. The university she attended had a different name back then. Over time, it was reorganized, renamed, and eventually became the same university I ended up attending. Because of that, whenever she talked about her time there as a student, it always felt oddly familiar to me. When she described the streets, the houses students rented, the little corner shops, the bus stops, and the shortcuts people used to get to campus, I could picture them easily. I had walked those same streets myself years later. I had passed the same kinds of houses. It made her stories feel less like distant memories and more like something that had happened somewhere I personally understood. When my mom was a student, she lived in shared housing with several other young women. It was the typical student arrangement. Everyone had their own small bedroom and they shared a kitchen, a bathroom, and a living area. The house wasn't fancy, but it was affordable and close to the university, which was all that really mattered. Like most student houses, it had a relaxed atmosphere. People came and went at different hours. Friends visited. Music played late at night sometimes. Doors were locked out of habit more than fear. It was the kind of environment where no one expected anything truly dangerous to happen. Then one day something strange occurred. Someone had been inside the house. At first, no one was entirely sure how it had happened. There were small signs that something was wrong. Things weren't exactly where they had been left. A door that someone was certain they had closed was open. But the most confusing part was that nothing important seemed to be missing. No electronics were gone, no wallets or purses, no large valuables. It looked like someone had broken in and taken nothing. The housemates were understandably shaken. Even if nothing was stolen, the idea that a stranger had entered their home without them knowing was disturbing enough. They called the police and reported what had happened. Officers came to the house and looked around. They asked questions. They checked doors and windows. But there wasn't much evidence to work with. There were no witnesses, no obvious signs of forced entry, and nothing stolen that could help narrow down a motive. The police advised them to be more careful about locking doors and windows, and told them to call again if anything else happened. For a while, life returned to normal. Then it happened again. Another break-in. Again, nothing valuable was taken. The police were called again. The same process repeated. Questions were asked. The house was checked, and the same frustrating conclusion was reached. Someone had definitely been inside, but there was no clear evidence of who or how. After that, it happened more than once. Each time, the same strange pattern appeared. Someone had been in the house. Something small had been moved or disturbed, but nothing that would normally attract a burglar was missing. For the girls living there, the situation became increasingly stressful. They talked about it constantly. They tried to figure out what was going on. They wondered if someone had a spare key. Maybe a previous tenant still had access. Maybe one of them had forgotten to lock something, but no explanation ever fully made sense. During this time, my mom noticed something else. Some of her clothes had gone missing. Not big things, not jackets or shoes, just small items, personal items, underwear. At the time, she didn't think much about it. In a house with multiple people sharing laundry spaces, it wasn't unusual for things to get mixed up or disappear temporarily. Clothes sometimes ended up in the wrong basket or drawer. She assumed one of her housemates might have taken something by accident, or maybe someone had borrowed it, or maybe she had simply misplaced it herself. It felt too minor to confront anyone about, and she didn't want to accuse anyone without being sure, so she ignored it. Looking back, that detail is one of the most unsettling parts of the entire story, because the missing items were not random, but she had no way of knowing that at the time. Eventually, my mom moved out of the house. The move had nothing to do with the break-ins. It happened for completely separate reasons. She needed to change living arrangements, and the decision happened fairly quickly. It wasn't something she had been planning for months. She packed her things, moved out, and left the house behind. Her room didn't stay empty for long. Another girl moved into it soon afterward. And then something happened that changed everything. Either the same night the new girl moved in, or possibly the night after, the house was broken into again. But this time it wasn't just another quiet intrusion. The girl who had taken my mum's old room was attacked. She was raped. The violence of the crime shattered any illusion that the earlier break-ins had been harmless or meaningless. Suddenly, what had seemed like a strange but minor problem turned into something terrifying. The police response changed immediately. This wasn't trespassing anymore. This was a serious and violent crime. The investigation expanded quickly. The officers began looking into other cases, other reports, other suspicious incidents involving student housing. Eventually, the man responsible was caught. When his crimes became public, the media gave him a name that would follow him everywhere. They called him the bedsit rapist. The name came from the type of places he targeted: small rented rooms and shared housing, often used by students or young women living alone. As investigators examined his crimes, a pattern started to emerge. He didn't choose his victims randomly. He stalked them. He watched them. He learned their routines. He learned when they were home and when they weren't. One of the most disturbing parts of his method was what he did before the attacks. He broke into their homes, sometimes more than once. He would enter quietly and move through the space while they were gone. He didn't steal electronics or money. Instead, he took personal items, clothing, underwear, things that created a twisted sense of control over the person he had chosen. When the police pieced all of this together, something deeply disturbing became clear. My mum had been his intended target. After his arrest, a police officer contacted her directly. They explained that based on the pattern of break-ins at that house and the missing items from her room, investigators believed he had been stalking her specifically. The earlier break-ins weren't random, they were part of his process. He had been watching her, studying her, preparing, but when she moved out of the house so suddenly, he didn't know she had left. He returned, broke in again, and attacked the girl who had taken her room. That realization is what makes the story so difficult to think about. My mum wasn't spared because he changed his mind. She wasn't spared because someone stopped him. She was spared because she moved out at the right time. A simple decision that probably felt ordinary ended up changing everything. At the same time, another girl suffered because of that mistake, because he didn't realize his target was gone. There's no comfort in that part of the story, only the chilling understanding of how random survival can sometimes be. When my mum told me this story, she didn't dramatize it. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She told it calmly, almost like she was explaining a piece of history. But underneath her words, you could feel the weight of it. The knowledge that someone had been inside her room. The knowledge that someone had been watching her. The knowledge that something terrible had almost happened. What unsettles me the most is how normal everything seemed at the time. A student house, a few strange break-ins, some missing clothing, nothing that clearly screamed danger, not until it was too late for someone else. Whenever I walk through the city where we both studied, I sometimes think about that story, about the houses I pass, about the students living in them now, about how easily danger can exist quietly in the background without anyone noticing. Predators don't always begin with violence. Sometimes they begin with patience, with watching, with small tests, with stolen items no one notices right away. And sometimes survival comes down to something as simple as timing, a sudden move, a change of plans, a decision that feels ordinary in the moment, but turns out to have saved a life.